5-Minute Habits for Healthy Living. This week is habit number 5, read nutritional labels. Hello, this is Dr. Brian Morris, and welcome to 5-Minute Habits for Healthy Living, where you will learn the tools to practice a healthy lifestyle 5 minutes at a time. Life has become very complicated with a seemingly endless amount of health information at our fingertips on the internet. How do you know what to believe and what not to believe? In these podcast episodes, I will sort through the maze of health information and distill it into easy to digest, time-tested, evidence-based practical strategies for optimal health. I've been practicing internal medicine for 20 years. I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins. I trained at Yale, and I previously held a teaching position at Harvard Medical School. I currently practice medicine and hold a teaching appointment at UCLA Medical School here in Los Angeles, where I teach these tools and these strategies to medical students, house staff, doctors, and of course, to my patients. Before we get to this week's habit, I'd like to remind you that the information contained in this podcast and at 5minutemd.com is intended solely for educational purposes and should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any health condition or illness. This information may not apply to a specific health situation and is not a substitute for medical care by a qualified, licensed, board-certified healthcare professional. Please consult with your healthcare provider before implementing any of the ideas in this podcast or making any changes in your healthcare regimen. This week's habit is number 5, which is read nutritional labels. Most foods in the grocery store have labels that simply and clearly let us know what is healthy, what is not healthy, and what is somewhere in between. The trick is that we need to understand how to quickly read nutritional labels, make an overall assessment, and then make our purchasing decisions based on this information. It is much easier to make the primary decision not to buy something in the first place at the grocery store than it is to have to say no to it every time that we see it in the home. Once you bring the quote-unquote wolf into the house, it's a lot harder to get that wolf out of the home. We need to say no to as many unhealthy products as possible when we're at the grocery store or if we're shopping online, and say yes to as many healthy products as possible as well. Having as many healthy products in the home makes life so much easier because, frankly, we're much more likely to eat the foods that are readily available in the home than we are to eat the foods that are not readily available in the home. If something is not in your house, you would have to go out and purchase it. And if something is hidden in the back of a closet somewhere, you'd also have to do some work to go get that food. In general, we're tired at the end of the day, we're looking for something quick to eat, and if there's something readily available that's healthy, like fruits and vegetables that are right there, easy to obtain, we're going to typically grab those and make good choices. And on the other hand, if there are unhealthy foods that are sitting right there in the cupboard or right in the kitchen and readily available, we may grab those foods. So the first step is to read nutritional labels, and then the second step would be to bring in as many healthy products as possible into the home. And then the third step would be to say yes and to eat those healthy foods when we want to have something to eat at home. But it all starts with nutritional labels. You have to be able to read nutritional labels, understand the general principles, and then make good choices based on this information. So what are the keys to reading nutritional labels? The first 2 keys are, number 1, to control the number of calories that we consume each day, and number 2, to make those calories count, to eat the healthiest, most optimal calories as possible, to eat the nutrient-dense calories rather than the refined, processed, empty calories. So how do we accomplish these goals? Well, I've come up with an 8-step crash course on nutrition label reading, and I'd like to briefly review those 8 steps with you now. These 8 steps give you a good general framework to use when you look at nutritional labels in the store or if you're looking online. The nice thing about shopping online now is that most of this information is available on many of the websites that are used to purchase foods. So step 1 is to look at the number of calories per serving for a given food. Remember that back in habit 1 and then in habit 4, we figured out how many calories we should be eating per day. So when you look at a nutritional label in the store, you want to look at how many calories per serving that product has, and you'd want to figure out if that's something that would fit into your plan. In particular, if you haven't listened to episode 4 where I went through the ADAPT, A-D-A-P-T, the ADAPT model, where I reviewed how to assess how many calories you should be eating per day and then the process to go through to make sure that you're accomplishing this goal. But the first step here in this 8-step crash course is to look at the calories per serving. The listed calories usually correspond to 1 serving on a box, but sometimes these companies might make it a little complicated and have the calories listed per half serving or per 2 servings. So first you want to look at how many calories there are per serving, and then you also want to get an idea of how big that serving is. If the serving is not that much food and you may end up eating 3 or 4 or 5 servings, then you'd have to multiply the number of calories by that factor to see exactly how many calories you would be eating. So here you would figure out how many calories this product had and whether it's something that would work in your nutritional plan. If this product does not work for you, you put it back on the shelf and you do not purchase it and you move on to another product to see if you can find something else that might work for you. If this product does work for your nutritional plan, then you go on to step 2. You look at the saturated fat. The saturated fat grams. Your daily saturated fat grams should be less than 20 grams per day. In terms of fats, most people will look at the total number of fat grams per serving. However, I do not recommend that people do this because there are some fats that are unhealthy, such as saturated and trans fats, and there are also some fats that are generally healthy, such as monounsaturated and some polyunsaturated fats. Most labels will list the total fat grams, the saturated fat grams, and the trans fat grams. If you want to estimate the good fat, the quote-unquote good fat grams, what you do is you take the number for the total amount of fat and you subtract the saturated and the trans fat numbers. So if it says that there are 6 grams of total fat per serving and it has 2 grams of saturated fat and 1 gram of trans fat, then that would leave a total of 3 grams of the quote-unquote good fat per serving. By the good fat, I am referring to the unsaturated fats, which include the polyunsaturated and the monounsaturated fats. In general terms, these are the fats that tend to be healthy, while the saturated and the trans fats are the types of fats that in general tend to be less healthy or unhealthy. These are general statements, by the way, that I'm making about the types of fats. There are some exceptions to these rules, but in general terms, these principles are helpful in understanding which are the good and which are the bad fats. So for this step, though, you want to look at the saturated fats and be thinking that you're allowed to have up to 20 grams of saturated fat per day. Even less than that would even be better. But if it does have a significant number of saturated fat grams, 3, 4, 5 grams per serving, I would generally recommend that you put that back on the shelf. Step 3, you look at the trans fat. In my opinion, the trans fat should always say 0. If the trans fat grams says anything besides 0, put that product back on the shelf. Step 4, you look at the good fat, which we've already done when I discussed step 2. So you'd want to look at the good fat grams. And it's actually a good thing to have a few grams of the quote-unquote good fat. And again, the way you calculate the good fat, which is the unsaturated fats or the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated fats, the way you calculate that is you take the total fat and you subtract the trans fat, and then you subtract the saturated fat grams, and that would give you the mono and the polyunsaturated fat grams, which is generally healthy. These unsaturated fat grams tend to be filling, and we do need some of these in our diet. Step 5, we look at the fiber grams. In general, we should be buying foods that have more than 2 or 3 grams of fiber per serving. Our daily fiber amount should be about 25 to 30 grams in a given day. So if a product has very few grams of fiber, that is a strike against it. You can still purchase foods that have very little fiber, but in general, if it has more than 2 or 3 grams per serving of fiber, then that's a good thing. In regards to fiber, there was a really interesting study in 2011 that showed that those who consume the most fiber have a 22% lower risk of death, especially if the fiber comes from whole grains. We will return to the topic of whole grains in a future habit. Step 6, we look at the sugar grams per serving. In general, we should be purchasing foods that have less than 5 grams of sugar per serving, or even as low as possible. Daily sugar, the amount of sugar that we eat in a 24-hour period, should be less than 30 grams. So when you're looking at a box in the grocery store, look at how much sugar there is per serving. If it has more than 5 or 6 or 7 grams per serving, it probably isn't something that you want to purchase. Now, some companies will disguise the amount of sugar in a product by using other terms such as sugar alcohol or some other word that isn't quite sugar but sort of sounds like sugar. When I calculate the total sugar, I include both the amount of simple sugar as well as the amount of sugar alcohol listed because these are very similar. If this total amount of simple sugar and sugar alcohol is more than 5 or 6 or 7 grams per serving, then it's probably something you don't want to buy. Number 7, I look at the amount of protein per serving. Protein is something that is filling and is very important to the human diet. In general, if there's less than 2 grams of protein per serving, it probably is not something that you want to purchase. When you're looking at the nutritional label, look at the amount of protein grams per serving. And finally, step 8, you look at the sodium quantity. You look at the number of milligrams of sodium per serving. This should be as low as possible. Your daily sodium intake in general should be less than 2,300 milligrams per day. So when you're looking at your nutritional labels, always try to buy the food that has the least amount of sodium per serving. If something has more than 2 or 3 or 400 milligrams per serving of sodium, then it's probably not something that you want to purchase. So these are the 8 steps that you should go through in your mind as you're looking at nutritional labels in the grocery store or online. The first step is you look at the number of calories per serving. Number 2, you look at the amount of saturated fat per serving. Number 3, you look at the amount of trans fat per serving. Number 4, you look at the amount of good fat or poly and monounsaturated fat per serving. This is the total fat minus the saturated fat minus the trans fat. Number 5, we look at the fiber grams per serving. Number 6, we look at the sugar grams per serving. Number 7, we look at the protein grams per serving. And number 8, we look at the number of sodium milligrams per serving. These are the steps that you should go through in your mind. And as you go through this in your mind more often, you'll start to get very facile with this. And as you start to review these 8 steps in the grocery store, it will become much easier and less time consuming. Your homework now for this week, I'd like you to go through your home and read all the nutritional labels on the boxes of the products in your home. You may be surprised how many unhealthy foods have found their way into your cupboard and refrigerator. After you've read the labels, do your best to remove the unhealthiest foods from your home. And from now on, always read nutritional labels when you shop at the grocery store or if you shop online. If you're trying to decide between 2 or 3 items at the store, make it a habit to purchase the one that appears to be the healthiest based on the nutritional labels. Taste is a factor. I am not saying that taste is not an important factor. In fact, taste is. And if there are 2 foods that are pretty comparable health-wise and one tastes better, certainly buy the food that tastes better. A good principle to have when you shop is to buy the healthiest food that still tastes reasonably good. And as time goes on, by the way, foods that may not taste so great now may become more appealing to you the more that you start to eat them and enjoy them. And another good strategy is to buy an assortment of healthy foods at the store and see what tastes may appeal to you. Once you find healthy foods that taste good, make them regulars for yourself. Eating the same foods on a regular basis may seem kind of boring, but it turns out that this is usually a very practical way to make consistently good choices and thus improve your health and well-being. This all begins with reading nutritional labels and purchasing the products that nourish our health. In future episodes, we will return to the nutritional label, but for now, remember the 8-step crash course that we just reviewed. This is a very helpful way to read nutritional labels quickly and get an assessment on how healthy or unhealthy a product may be. Use this information to bring healthier foods into your home and into your world. Let's keep the dialogue going. Let me know what you think of this week's Habit for Healthy Living. Post your comments and your experiences on the 5 Minute MD Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter at Brian Morris MD, and visit us anytime on our website, 5minutemd.com. Let your friends and your family and your colleagues know about this podcast, and make sure that you are subscribed on iTunes. When you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, you will receive new podcast episodes as soon as they are posted. Also, in the next few months, we will be posting bonus podcast episodes at 5minutemd.com, including special podcast episodes not available on iTunes. And if you're finding the information on this podcast helpful, we would really appreciate it if you would take a moment and stop by iTunes and leave us a review. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to make today count. I will see you at the next 5.